What happens when a freak accident turns into something more sinister? Unfortunately for the Sodder family, they found out one fateful night when a house fire turned into a full blown missing children's case. This is the case of the Sodder children. In a quiet community nestled in Fayetteville, West Virginia, lived the Sodders. The house consisted of George and Jenny Sodder and 9 of their 10 children. George was born in Italy in 1895. He immigrated to the States 13 years later. He started working on the railroads in Pennsylvania and then quickly found more permanent work as a driver in Smithers, West Virginia. He then moved to owning his own company, first with hauling fill dirt and then quickly moving to hauling coal that had been mined in the region. Jenny was a storekeeper's daughter and had also immigrated from Italy when she was younger. When the two met each other, it was love at first sight. They got married in 1922. They eventually settled in a 2-story timber frame home in Fayetteville, just 2 miles north of the town. In 1923, they brought their first child into the picture. And with a growing family and business that was booming, the Sodders were very happy. They were well respected in their community, and most things went off without a hitch. The only small thing is that George did have very strong opinions about the Italian dictator at the time, Benito Mussolini, which led to some arguments with other members of the immigrant families in that community. But otherwise, life was good for the Sodders for many years. They continued to add more members to the family. Business was going well. That is until Christmas Eve, 1945. The night started off as one filled with joy and laughter. That year, most of the family had stayed up past their bedtimes because Marion, the eldest daughter, had been working at a store downtown and wanted to surprise her younger sisters, Martha, who was 12, Jenny, who was 8, and Betty, who was 5, with new toys she was able to buy them for Christmas. At around 10 p.m., Jenny told the kids that were still awake they could stay up a little longer as long as the boys, Maurice, who was 14, and Louise, who was 9, remembered their nightly chores, putting the cows away from the pasture and feeding the chickens. At this time, George and the 2 eldest boys, John, who was 22, and George Jr., who was 16, had been working all day with their father, and they were already asleep. After reminding the children one last time to do the chores, Jenny took Sylvia, who was 3, to go to bed to themselves. At around midnight, Jenny was startled awake by the ringing of their telephone. The voice that came through the other end of the line was a woman that Jenny did not recognize, asking for a name that she did not know. She remembers hearing the clinking of glasses and the sound of laughter in the background. Jenny explained to the caller that she had reached the wrong number and hung up the phone. When she went to go back to bed, she quickly noticed that the lights were still on and the curtains weren't drawn, which was something that her kids would have typically done before they went to bed. But she quickly noticed that Marion had fallen asleep on the couch, so she put no second thought into it. She turned off the lights, drew the curtains, and quickly went back to bed. At the time, she had assumed that all her other kids were upstairs asleep. At around 1 a.m., Jenny was startled awake again by a loud bang on her roof, followed by a rolling noise. She stayed awake for a little while, but when no other noises followed, she turned back around and fell back asleep. Around a half an hour later, she was woken up again by the smell of smoke. She soon realized that George's office space was ablaze, noting that the fire was around the telephone wires and the fuse box. Jenny woke up George, who in turn woke up the older sons. Jenny, George, and 4 of the children, Marion, Sylvia, John, and George Jr., escaped the house. John, in the first police interview, stated that he had gone upstairs to wake the other children, but then later changed his report, stating that he had never actually seen the other siblings, that the staircase was already in flames, so the family had only screamed at the other kids to get out of the house. Somehow, the night only gets weirder from here. It took the family an unusual amount of time to be able to contact anyone about the fire. The phones did not work, so Marion had to run to a neighboring house to contact the fire department. While this is occurring, a driver on the nearby road also saw the fire and went to a nearby tavern to call. But were both unsuccessful, either from the phones not working or an operator not answering the other line. Meanwhile, George, who is barefoot, is scaling the side of his house and breaking open a nearby window, resulting in a gash in his arm to try and get into the house. Him and his sons had intended to use a ladder that was usually propped up against the house to get into the window to get the other kids out, but when they went to go find the ladder, they noticed that it was gone. They couldn't find it. A water barrel that could also have aided in getting a fire out was frozen solid, so that was useless. And then George frantically decides that he can use his trucks to get into the open window to aid him in climbing in, but soon realized neither of his trucks were going to start for a reason George was not sure of, because both vehicles had ran the day prior. Over the span of 45 minutes, the Sodder family watched as their home burned to the ground, assuming that the other 5 children perished in the fire. As if the night is not weird enough up to this point, the fire department did not show up to the scene until the following morning. They stated that they were low on manpower due to the war at the time, and were relying on individual firefighters to just call each other to try and get someone out to the scene. On top of all that, Chief F.J. Morris stated that his inability to drive the fire truck further hampered the already slow response by the team, because he had to wait for another team member that was qualified to be able to drive the truck. When they finally arrived the following morning, there really was nothing the firefighters could do but sift through the ashes that were left in the basement. Around 10 a.m., Morris told the family that no bones had been found, but that Morris believed that the other children had died in the fire, suggesting that the fire was hot enough to not find any evidence of their bodies. Morris told the family to leave the site untouched so that the fire marshal could come out and do a thorough investigation. But for some reason, after only 4 days, George and his wife stated they could no longer look at the scene, that it caused too much grief, so they just bulldozed 5 feet of dirt over the top of the crime scene. They had stated that they were going to turn it into a memorial garden for their children that they had lost in the fire. The following day, the local coroner marked the fire as an accident caused from faulty wiring. And the case goes cold from there. Death certificates were filed for the 5 missing children on December 30th of that year, and a funeral was held on January 2nd. But neither George nor Jenny attended their funerals, saying that they were too grief-stricken to attend. In the following spring, the Sodders did plant flowers in the soil where their home once stood, and Jenny did carefully tend to it for the rest of her life. The family following the fire would continue to question the authorities. They asked if it was faulty wiring, why their Christmas lights had remained on well into the fire. They also noted things like the missing ladder being found in an embankment 95 feet away. A phone line repairman telling the family that the phone lines had been snipped 14 feet up and 2 feet away from the phone pole and not burnt through like they had originally thought. A man was witnessed by neighbors stealing block and tackle the night of the fire around the time the fire was started. He was later arrested by officials and admitted to cutting the phone line thinking it was a power line, and to the theft, but denied having anything to do with the fire. However, looking into the case, no official reports of the suspect exists. Also, why a man would cut the line and still block and tackle in the first place was never found out. Jenny also had a hard time believing that the fire burned so hot no trace of her children were left. A lot of their appliances were found still very recognizable left in the ash. They also found fragments of their tin roof. She compared it to a similar incident where a fire claimed a family of 7 and the skeletal remains of all the victims had been found. Jenny spiraled and would burn small animal bones to stimulate the fire, and the bones were never consumed by the flames. She contacted a member of the local crematorium and was told that human bones remain after bodies are burned at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 hours, which is far hotter and far longer than the original house fire was. The Sodder's truck failures were also brought up. George insisted they had been tampered with. However, one of George's sons-in-laws in 2013 told the Charleston Gazette that he believed George and his sons had probably flooded the engines. The driver of a bus that had passed through Fayetteville late that Christmas Eve had stated he saw some people throwing balls of fire at the Sodder home. Months later, when the snow had melted, Sylvia had found a rubber-like ball object in the brush nearby. George, recalling his wife saying she heard a large thump on the roof that night, insisted that his object was a pineapple bomb, a hand grenade, or a similar incendiary device, and insisted that the fire had started on the roof. But by this point, there was no way to prove this theory. Other witnesses started coming out claiming that they had seen the missing Sodder children. One woman accounting that she had seen the children while watching the fire from the road, peeking from a nearby car. Another woman claimed to have served the missing kids breakfast that following morning at a rest stop between Fayetteville and Charleston. She noted that there was a car with Florida license plate parked in the parking lot as well. In October of that year, before the fire took place, an insurance salesman had visited George. After George turned him down, the salesman warned George that his house would go up in smoke and his children would be destroyed because of his dirty remarks George had been making about Mussolini. On a different occasion, a worker had walked around the back of George's house and told George that his fuse boxes were going to start a fire someday. George remembers being puzzled about the worker's observation because he had just had the house rewired when they put in the new stove, and it had been expected and deemed safe. The older siblings also recall a time where they were coming home from school and there was a van that had been parked along the main highway watching them. The parents were convinced this was a kidnapping and hired a private investigator from a neighboring town by the name C.C. Tinsley. He discovered that the insurance salesman who had previously threatened George over his anti-Mussolini sentiments had been on the coroner's jury who had originally ruled the fire accidental. He also learned from rumors that he had spread across Fayetteville that Morris had found a heart in the ash and had packed it into a metal box and secretly buried it without telling the family. Apparently, Morris had confessed to his local minister, and the news found its way to George and Tinsley. They approached Morris, and he agreed to show the two where he had buried the box. When the box was dug up, all that was inside was fresh beef liver that had never been exposed to fire. Later, more rumors circulated that Morris had admitted to putting the liver in the box with the hopes that the Sodder family would find it and be satisfied that the missing children had indeed died in the fire. In August of 1949, George was able to persuade a Washington, D.C. pathologist to assist in a search of the dirt at the house site. After the search, some artifacts, including the children's dictionary and some coins, were found, along with several bone fragments that were sent off to be studied by a specialist at the Smithsonian. Marshall Newman found that the bone fragments did indeed belong to a human. They were that of the vertebrae. He also stated that they did all come from the same individual, but because the transverse recesses were fused and the center was still unfused, it would lead him to believe that the individual was 16 or 17 at the time of death. This made it unlikely that the bones belonged to any of the 5 missing Sodder children, given that Maurice was the oldest child and was only 14 at the time. Newman also stated that the bones showed no signs of exposure to flame, and they concluded that the vertebrae was likely from the dirt George had stirred up to bury the home site. He further backed the claim that it was very odd that they found no other bone fragments, considering a wood fire of such short duration would not burn hot enough to consume a full human skeleton. In 1950, West Virginia legislation held 2 hearings on the case after the findings had started to attract national attention. However, Governor Okie Patson and State Police Superintendent W.E. Burchett told the Sodders that the case was hopeless and closed it at a state level. The FBI decided they had jurisdiction as a possible interstate kidnapping, but dropped the case after 2 years of following leads that never led to anything. Although, at an official level, all efforts had ceased, the Sodder family continued to look for their missing children. They printed flyers with pictures of the children, offering a $5,000 reward for information that would lead to some kind of closure for the family. That amount soon doubled to $10,000. In 1952, the family put up 2 billboards, one at the original home site and one along Route 60 near Ansted. The family efforts soon led to more calls coming in with sightings of the missing children. A woman who ran a hotel in Charleston claimed to have seen the children approximately a week after the fire. The children had come in around midnight with 2 men and 2 women, all of whom appeared to her to be of Italian descent. When she attempted to speak to the children, one of the men looked at her in a hostile manner and proceeded to turn around while rapidly talking in Italian. She noted that immediately after, the whole group stopped interacting with her, and then she recalled that the group did leave the following morning. Another caller claimed that Martha was being held in a covenant in St. Louis, Missouri. A bar patron called in and claimed that he had overheard 2 other people making incriminating statements about a fire that happened in West Virginia on the night of Christmas Eve. George followed up with all the leads, but none of them proved to have any significance. George, too, began to spiral, and when he found out some relatives in Florida had children that looked similar to his own kids, the relative had to prove to him that the children were in fact their children and not George's. In 1967, another tip came in that led George to Houston, Texas, where a woman claimed that Lewis had admitted to her his true identity one night after having too much to drink. She told the family she believed that Lewis and Maurice were both living in Texas somewhere. However, when George and his son-in-law Grover Paxton arrived, they were unable to speak to the woman. Police in the area did aid in tracking down the 2 men that the woman had claimed were the kids, but they denied being the missing children. Paxton said that the doubts about that denial played on George for the rest of his life. Years later, another letter came in, and this letter was the most credible evidence that their son was still alive to the Sodder family. The letter was addressed to Jenny with no return address. Inside was a picture of a young man around the age of 30 with features that strongly resembled their missing son Lewis. On the back of the photo was the words, "Lewis Sodder, I love my brother Frankie, Lil Boys, A90132 or 35. The family hired another private detective to look into the letter, but were unable to find anything. The picture did bring the family a renewed sense of hope. They proceeded to add it to their billboard and added an enlarged version hanging above their fireplace. No one ever did find out what happened to the Sodder children that night. There are lots of theories surrounding this case, obviously. One of them being kidnapping. Things such as the ladder being found so far away, the phone line being cut, the trucks not starting. All those lead people to believe that it was not an accident at all and that it was set on purpose. There are others that believe that the officials themselves had something to do with it, and even some that believe that the family themselves did it because it's odd to them to think that with an ongoing investigation, George and Jenny would just plow dirt right over the top of any kind of evidence that was left behind. Nonetheless, this is just another case of missing children that we still don't know what happened to them, and it is truly, truly sad to know that no one got closure. The parents have since passed, and up to the end, they never stopped fighting, looking for their children. But you tell me what you think in the comments, and I will catch you next time. Bye.